Hello, everyone, and welcome to V.A.C. Roundtable number 65. It's the end of the week, but it's not the end of the world. So we're welcoming Chris Bennett this fine Friday, who is one of the primary theologians around cannabis and basically theology going back lots and lots of years, needless to say. And we wanted to bring in Chris because he's also one of the foremost authors on the issue of religion and cannabis. And I can't thank him enough for joining us tonight. And we'll basically jump right into it, which is our first question we ask everybody, which is how did you come to cannabis? So, when did you originally hear about it? When did you first try it? You know, it's a multi-tier, answer because it's unique to every individual. We're not asking you who turned you on as much as, what were the circumstances? What made you choose that, this was going to be you know, your direction in life?
Yeah, well, I guess when I first started smoking, I was pretty young, 12. About a year before that, I discovered some in my brother's drawer, and I was horrified, that my older brother was doing drugs and thought that was it, and didn't know whether to report onto the police or my mom and dad or what. Really struggled with it. But then, I probably piqued my curiosity and I started smoking it when I was 12. And I always enjoyed it in that period. I didn't become a cannabis activist till about 1990, where it became a real focus of my life. And I think a lot of that had to do with Jack Herer's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which of course inspired a lot of activists. And all the information about industrial hemp, which I had no idea about at that time. Until I read that book, and it really did change my life. I lived in a logging and fishing town, and there was a lot of controversy about the logging there. And when I started finding out about hemp as an alternative to cutting down old growth rainforests, it really caught my attention. And I started a group, Patriotic Canadians for Hemp, and around that time, I had a religious experience that led me to start studying the role of cannabis in all sorts of different religions, leading to the 5 books I've written on the topic over the last 30 years.
And quite a few books you have written. How many books have you written on the subject now?
I've written 5. I co-authored Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana, Magic, and Religion in 1995, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, which really looked at the cannabism references in 2001 and 2010, Cannabis in the Soma Solution, 2018, Libra 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult, which looked at its role in alchemy and magic in the medieval Renaissance period. And then most recently, Cannabis, the Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World, which was inspired in part by this fascinating archaeological information that's come out of Tel Arad, Jerusalem in Israel, where they found the remains of an 8th century BCE Hebrew temple site. And cannabis resins had been burned on an altar beside another altar where frankincense resins had been burned. And so I decided to look at these Hebrew cannabism references, which a lot of people have heard of, in light of this new archaeological evidence.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's very succinct. And thank you for your years of authorship. I've appreciated, and I've got quite a few of your books myself, and have shared them with people because those of us that grew up, I grew up originally in Catholic Church before I became a non-believer. However, learned a lot about history and raised questions as it became more drug knowledged. I could see cracks or references in, of course, the Bible, etc. And of course, I was fortunate to have Jack Herrera come to, my university back in '89, and he was talking about, all about the mushroom and how, the aisles and the churches are shaped like the stem, and how the edges and how they are completely shaped like mushrooms. And, so it really started my own curiosity. And again, you were the really only author that had information that was talking about the esoterics, talking about, various major religions and the access to cannabis, not just Catholicism, not just Judaism. It crosses, as we know with cannabis, it crosses every socioeconomic boundary as well as every religious boundary as well, apparently. So thank you for your constant dedication, and we appreciate what you're doing. Next up will be Councilmember Peggy Jones.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so very much for joining us this evening.
I think.
So, my question is, for those who are taught cannabis is the devil's lettuce by the clergy, how would you convince them otherwise when even quoting scripture fails?
Well, I think a big thing is to point out the medical use of it, you know what I mean, and try to distinguish between medical and recreational. I think there's an inherent fear of drugs in modern Christianity, and I think that even modern prohibition in the U.S. in a lot of ways could be seen as a Christians versus the devil's weed. Now, this is where this interesting information, the archaeological information coming out of Tel Arad, Jerusalem, where they found these two altars, comes in because it's in ancient Israel in the biblical period, right? And it's undeniable. However, given that, when this material came to light in 2020, the response, a lot of people were, the pro side was all going, oh, this proves the Hebrew references to cannabis, that it was used in the holy anointing oil and everything. Whereas another side was saying this is indicative of pagan activity. And when you understand the context of this particular archaeological find and the time period, both are right. And it's, when we're dealing with history of groups of people, we're dealing with centuries, and different things happen at different times, and views change on things. And that's the story of cannabis in the biblical period, in the Old Testament period. Is initially it begins as something that's very sacred, but then it's later removed as a symbol of polytheistic, which means the worship of many different gods, activity, right? And so this, it's like, I wish there was something better to bring Christian people to understand it than this, because it's going to be really controversial as people begin to understand what's going on here with cannabis in the Bible. And so I should probably delve into that a bit here, which is going to take me a little bit of time. So in 2020, as I mentioned, they found this, it's actually a trading post military site on the outskirts of Israel in Tel Arad, Jerusalem. And this site goes back to the 8th century BCE, and it appears in the Bible itself. They refer to it, and they know it's a biblical site. And within this fortress, there was a temple site that was based on the same construction patterns as the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem itself, as described in the biblical account, and same sort of pattern of design. And they know that this place was a version of the Holy of Holies because there's an inscription there that says the house of Yahweh, Yahweh being the Hebrew name of the biblical God. Sorry if I offended anybody by saying the name of God out there. Kind of a taboo topic amongst some Jewish people. But I want to be specific who I'm talking about, right? And so in this temple site, there was like a small room about the size of a broom closet, probably about 4 by 8. And there were 2 altars on there. And on one altar, cannabis resins were burnt. And the authors of the archaeological report specifically say likely hashish, where it wasn't raw cannabis, it was resin cannabis. And on the other altar, frankincense was burnt. And so this would have been, like burning a lot of cannabis in a small little broom closet would get filled up with smoke. Pipe smoking is thought to be relatively new to the old world. It came about after the discovery of tobacco pipe smoking in North America, but soon spread throughout the ancient world and was soon adopted by cannabis. That's kind of the general view, although there's some argument about that. But there's no evidence that the ancient Hebrews had pipes. So this was the way that they were taking it at this time, was burning it inside this room, right? Now, we also know that this temple site was well known for other reasons before it came to light that there were residues of cannabis. And I should also point out there were two standing stones beside the two altars, indicating that two deities were worshipped there. And this site was well known because they found numerous figurines pertaining to what is believed to be the Hebrew goddess Asherah. And although most lay people don't know this, amongst biblical scholars is very well known that the Hebrew god Yahweh at one time was coupled with a goddess, Asherah, and she was the mother of the gods. And in the Bible, she's depicted as, you know, something bad, a foreign form of worship, but you have to remember this is all written centuries after the fact in many cases. And from archaeological evidence from the region, there's many inscriptions that refer to things like Yahweh and his Asherah, and they appear together in inscriptions. We know for a fact that they were, this was the common means of worship, right? Now, this was really fascinating to me because I had studied the works of the Polish anthropologist, Jewish anthropologist, Sula Bennett, who in 1936, she first suggested that these Hebrew terms, canna and cannabosum, identified cannabis. And she said there was a phonetic connection to the modern term cannabis, followed it back through the Mishnah and other things, kind of boss is what's there, and said this was all the same word traveling down through time. And that in the, I think, 3rd century, or might be the 5th century, before the Common Era, when the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek for the Septuagint, this was mistranslated into calamus. And that the Hebrew term itself actually referred to cannabis. And what she did is also is I compared it to this Assyrian term, nabu. Somebody wanting to say something? Oh, I thought I heard something back there. It's this Assyrian term, kanabu, which is generally regarded as a reference to cannabis, and it's used in an identical way, often prepared into salves and also burnt as an incense. As well, in the Assyrian Babylonian references, it is burnt to a goddess. It's an offering to a goddess. It appears in offerings to Ishtar, Inanna, and Asherah. And in Asherah's references, it specifically refers to it as a salve, and the Ishtar references, it's prepared into a beer. And in the Inanna references, it's on a list of items going into the temple of Inanna, probably for an incense, they figure. And so this fits with what's happening over here at Tel Arad, where there's these two altars, one's dedicated to Yahweh and one's dedicated to Asherah. Now, when you follow these cannabosum references, it tells this same story. That's what's happening at Tel Arad. Now, as I said, there were people on the pro side saying that this was indicative of cannabosum because of the anointing oil, and the anti side that said, well, this was indicative of polytheistic activity. Both Tel Arad and cannabosum are in agreement because it depicts both sides of that parallel. In the earliest reference, Exodus 30:23, God commands Moses to make a holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of this cannabosum mixed with myrrh, cinnamon, cassia, into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that he's to use this oil, he's to place them on the altar of incense. And then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. He never speaks to the Lord unless it's in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. And in the story of Exodus, the other Jewish people can see that he's speaking to the Lord when the smoke's pouring out of the tent of the meeting, the small tent-like enclosure that this was held in. And this is similar to references in Assyria as well, where it's burnt as an incense. There's indications of an incense tent at the time of King Esarhaddon, who was involved in the sacred rites where cannabis was used in the Assyrian ritual. Also similar to Scythian use of the plant, where they would burn it in braziers and little tent-like structures that captured the smoke and inhaled the smoke. And it's likely the term canna itself was adopted from these Scythians or other Indo-European peoples, where the name of the plant was canna. And in the references to canna in the Bible, it is clear that it comes from a foreign land. The Ezekiel reference to canna describes it coming in on caravans. And the Jeremiah reference which rejects it, it in fact refers to it as coming from a foreign land, you know. Now, there's a number of references that, you know, it also appears in the Song of Songs. And there it appears alongside frankincense. And the Song of Songs is attributed to Solomon, who was accused of burning incense on high to the goddess in the Bible itself. He's condemned for that polytheistic activity of burning incense on high to the goddess. And some scholars, biblical scholars, believe the Song of Songs was the Hebrew version of what's known as the Hieros Gamos, or the sacred marriage. And this was where the god was coupled with the goddess, and that brought fertility to the land. And we see this with Ishtar and Tammuz and other deities in the Near East. And it's a very common kind of form of worship back then, erotic kind of activity facilitating the fertility of the land. And in the Song of Songs, you know, we read, your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, and henna and nard and saffron, canna and cinnamon, with every kind of frankincense tree. So this is interesting because it again connects it with this idea that God was at one time coupled with a goddess, right? Now in the Isaiah reference, 43, 23, 24, we read, I have not burdened you with offerings or wearied you with frankincense. You have not brought me fragrant canna with money or satisfied me with the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins and you have wearied me with your iniquities. Now, this reference is interesting because as with at Telerad, we have the combination of frankincense on one altar and cannabis on another altar. And in this particular reference, God's upset with Isaiah for coming with problems, but not bringing the appropriate sacrifices of fragrant cannabis, and frankincense. Now, I would say that there's indications in Isaiah that he didn't always show up empty-handed, because in one of my favorite biblical passages, Isaiah 6, 4-7, we read, and the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, woe is me, for I am a man undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thy iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Now, this is interesting because, you know, the seraphim goes right over to the altar of incense and with tongs picks up a coal and then holds it up to Isaiah's, but kind of like hot knifing or something, right? So he could take a direct hit. And in the earlier reference where he showed up empty-handed, you know, God complains about being burdened with sins and wearied with iniquities. However, in this case, when the incense is laid upon his lips, thine iniquity is taken away and thy sin purged, you know. I mentioned the Ezekiel reference already, right? And it, you know, shows it coming in as an item of trade, and this fits with the linguistic theories on cannabis being cannabis, and the as an item of trade, it came in with the Indo-European name, and that was adopted as that into the Hebrew language. Now, the Jeremiah 6:20 is a real clincher in this. This is in the book of Jeremiah. Now, one of the reasons this altar site in Temple at Telerad, Jerusalem, was so well preserved is because it was canceled and it was buried in a day. Somebody went in there, knocked over the altars, buried them in sand, and built a floor right on top of it, and went back to doing something else. So this is why it's so accounted. And it's believed by scholars that this happened either at the time of Josiah or Hezekiah. And these were two kings, Hezekiah, the grandfather, Josiah, the grandson, that were largely responsible for trying to initiate monotheism into Judaism. And, you know, when I'm talking about the transition from polytheism, the worship of many deities, to monotheism, it's more than theological. It's also political. You have to envision that at this time period, a time period of Hezekiah, for instance, the much larger Assyrian Empire was encroaching on them. They were vassals of the Assyrians, having to pay lots of tribute, and they were trying to fight against it. And as with politics and and religion, it's hard with there's multiple groups, so if you have all these different cults vying for the ear of the king and telling them what to do, it's really hard to control the populace. Monotheism was an innovative way to consolidate worship and control. All the money went to the temple in Jerusalem. All the other temples, even ones like the one at Tel Arad, were shut down, and it was centralized worship in Jerusalem itself and control of the land, right? And this all happened during the time of Jeremiah. At the time of Hezekiah as well, he's described as going into the temple, removing the Asherah poles, and then taking out the brazen serpent that Moses made because the people of Israel were burning incense to this brazen serpent. And this is interesting because this is all stuff kind of related to the Garden of Eden mythology, which is actually written much later than all this and may well be a reversal of this earlier cosmology. But anyways, Jeremiah 6:20, we read, "What do I care about frankincense from Sheba or sweet-smelling canna from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me." So here we see the cannabisum that was, part of the holy anointing oil used in the tent of the meeting, completely rejected, coming from a distant land. The frankincense is associated with Sheba, who plays a role in the story of Solomon. Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me. These aren't, so it's completely rejected. And so what's happened here is this is a time period where all this polytheism is getting shut down, but it's also the end of the prophetic era, the age of prophets. After this time period, the references are, if your son's a prophet, stab him, what I mean? Be a farmer, be anything, don't be a prophet. Because just as the centralization of worship was important, so was the centralization of the religious law. And everybody's got to be on the same page. And this is where we start to see the age of the book. And in fact, during Josiah's reign, the grandson of Hezekiah, they claim to have been doing reconstructions in the temple built by Solomon, who was polytheistic, who burned incense on high to the goddess. And they found the book of Deuteronomy, allegedly written by Moses, but the style of Deuteronomy's writing is thought to come from a much later time period, contemporary with the discovery of it. So it was likely forgery written then. And it prohibited all forms of worship, the Asherah, the other deities, Baal, all these other deities that were worshipped throughout the land. And this is where we start to see it. But it's also where the Hebrew kingdom falls, and they go off into Babylonian exile. And so you can kind of see there, and then Jeremiah 44, he comes into contact with Jewish people that are living in Egypt, and he blames them for the fall of Jerusalem, specifically because he blames it on them burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her. And this is likely a reference to Asherah. And we know that cannabis was burnt to these other goddesses that have a connection to Asherah, probably all coming from a much earlier version of the goddess, and then splitting off into different regional identities. But Ishtar, they would pour out drink offerings of cannabis beer to her. Incenses were burnt to Ishra and Inanna. So it's pretty clear that's the connection, right? And that's the story of cannabisum and Tel Arad. However, that's not the end of the story of the Jews. Now, I don't think there was any attempt to hide this on the part of the Hebrew authors, because it tells a story. You know what I mean? It's all kind of connected, and it's nicely laid out. I think either when it was translated into Greek, either it was a mistake. Some people think it might have been intentional. I'm not convinced it was intentional. There's so many plants in the Bible. There's been other mistakes of plants identifications in there that we know of now, and it may have just been a mistake. Yeah, sorry for such a long, drawn out explanation there, but I think it's important to be clear on a lot of this stuff.
No, and that's why we brought you here, and the time is free specifically for that. Michael Crowitz, you had a follow-up before we go to our next question.
Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, it's so good to see you, Chris. And thanks for coming on. Veterans Action Council, what was it? The roundtable number
65.
65. So my question, I wanted to follow up. If I read the artifacts correctly, from the United States war on drugs, and I want to sort of tap into your expertise, but apply it as an activist for a second. And what I perceive is happening, like I said, from the artifacts, is that the church really didn't have a heck of a lot of involvement with cannabis until the government reached out to the church. The government being, in fact, the Attorney General of the United States, reaching out to the church and asking about this marijuana. It sort of predated the church viewing films on marijuana, which were again provided by the government, at least at first, which were played at least at first in churches before they were played in theaters. And my question is, assuming all the best of all so many different things, and assuming the best of these people, did they kind of fall for this because it sort of appealed to their baser instincts, things that we fall for sometimes, hate and fear and racism and things like that? Or was there something in the church teaching, something in the Bible that sort of set these folks up to take the wrong side on this?
I think there's a real parable with the Garden of Eden mythology, you know what I mean, in modern prohibition. It's kind of like the story of prohibition. Certainly lots of people writing about drugs and entheogens have seen it in that context. And, I mentioned earlier that it may be a reversal of the Asher mythology. And that's not like something I come up with. Biblical scholars, not even having anything to do with cannabis, have suggested the whole Eden mythology, which is one of the last things written, was this reversal of this earlier cosmology where basically Asherah had a tree of life, and it's likely a reference to her cannabis. Another archaeological find regarding Asherah is like woven cannabis, which appears in the Bible as well. They refer to the people weaving for Asherah in the temple, and they found a sacred loom associated with Asherah with the hemp cloth. So it's pretty clear that there's a connection there, and one of her symbols was the tree of life, and in the Eden myth, it's a serpent that seduces them. Well, they pulled out the brazen serpent during the reforms because the people were burning incense. So I think there's an inherent kind of thing of prohibition as well in like the book of Revelation, for instance. Anywhere you see the term sorcery, it's a translation of this Greek term pharmakia, which has the same root as our modern term pharmacy, but it refers to the use of psychoactive plants and magic and that sort of thing. So that's in there. And certainly, but it's when we're dealing with like Christian history, we're dealing with like millennia, man. And same with Jewish, and lots of things happen in lots of different times. Like in the 12th century, there was a pope who had I've got it kind of marked off here. Pope John the 21st, who lived from 1215 to 1277, is thought to have been the author of a Treasury of Health. And in his remedies, he's got a topical preparation against scabies and French pokies, whatever that is. That is a topical preparation of a cannabis type wine. And it applies it for other things as well. But then, by the later time period, say in the 1570s, 1630, a Catholic figure, Frederick Fournier, he wrote a big thing called 8 Ways the Sinners Are Like Cannabis. And, we're all twisted and we're weaving our sins and all this type of stuff, right? And so you're dealing with a lot of time period. I think that there was, certainly a fear amongst alchemists and magicians alike, witches and whatnot of the church, for their use of plants. And that's pretty clear that they were concerned that they were going to be persecuted for that. And I think in the medieval Renaissance period, throughout, it was kind of the view of the church that, you pray to get better. You know what I mean? There's not a real focus on medicines, but that's still not always 100%. You know what I mean? There's other times where medicines are used. I talk about that Pope there that wrote a Treasury of Health that had cannabis medicines and other herbal remedies. So you're dealing with a lot of time frame. And I don't think there's been any sort of like conscious conspiracy on the part of the church to suppress this type of stuff, you know what I mean? Like carried on anyway, maybe at different periods, people have come across something and we're going to shut that down. But I don't think, the Pope is really even aware of cannabism. I don't know what he's got to say about Telerad. I'd like to hear, but I think most of this type of stuff is news to them, but there is kind of an inherent fear of drugs. And I think that goes back to an association of, witchcraft and their use of in that type of things.
Thank you, Chris. Next up will be Council Member Al Burns.
Hey, Chris, I don't think we've met for about 30 years. I'm sure it was, yeah, I think it was at a normal conference way back in the day.
Oh,
But
nice.
it's good to see you, and you're fascinating. Unbelievable. Wow. Listen, cannabis, the plant, is it some sort of common denominator or not among the religions of the world? All of them. They
I think
all
it can
have a
be,
reference to them or not?
all of them would be, a stretch, but a lot of major ones, and I'll try to give a bit of a rundown. I've already talked about Judaism, Zoroastrian, another important ancient world religion, the religion of the Magi. There's references to cannabis infused wines. Zoroastrianism cannot be underestimated for the way that it influenced both Judaism and Christianity concepts, such as heaven and hell, end of the world, all that type of stuff comes into the Abrahamic religions through a Zoroastrian influence, and that's well accepted by scholars. And in the account of Ardu Viraf, where he goes off to see heaven and hell, he drinks 7 cups, golden cups of cannabis infused wine. It's knocked out for a day or two, and then comes back and then retells his vision. So Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, there's references going back at least 2,500 years to Buddha subsisting on 1 hemp seed a day under the Bodhi tree before announcing his 8 noble truths. And in Tibetan Buddhism, it certainly played a role. There's textual references in 10th and then 12th century Tibetan Buddhist texts to its ritual use, kind of more of a shamanic approach than earlier Buddhism. And Hinduism, it's been devoted to Shiva. Shiva is probably the oldest continually worshipped god on earth. His worship goes back to the Stone Age. Kali and other deities as well in Hinduism. In Taoism, Chinese Taoism, we have ancient poems and references to cannabis. A quatrain is first a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. And we have a lot of really cool archaeological evidence indicating the ritual use of cannabis out of China as well. Numbers of sites where raw cannabis, female flowers have been found, braziers where cannabis was burnt on. And Japanese Shintoism, it played a role certainly as a ritual cloth and paper. Hard to say if they were burning it as an incense or not, and so, those are some of the, and, possibly in Christianity, I think in Gnostic Christianity, certainly a really powerful case. But, the term Christ itself is the Greek translation of the Messiah. That's the Hebrew word for the anointed one, and refers to that anointing oil I refer to in Exodus 30:23, and in the biblical account, Jesus doesn't baptize anyone, but he sends out the 12 apostles with holy oil to cast out demons and heal the sick. And casting out demons in those days meant treating people for things like epilepsy. And we have Assyrian references to topical preparation with cannabis for the treatment of epilepsy, and later alchemical references from Paracelsus, the famed alchemist, who had a recipe for topical preparations for treating epilepsy. And certainly parents today treating their infants and children for epilepsy with cannabis see it as a miracle. And we can only imagine that would have been magnified much more so. But yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have a Carl Olsen who's joined us. He says, I don't know my history well, but I think the Jamaican term ganja is from India. Do you know how the Rastafarians came to use the term for their sacrament, or was the history cannabis has as a religious sacrament in India? The single convention refers to religious use in India.
Yeah, I just want to say Carl Olson's such a pioneer activist, and I have a lot of respect for him. I know we had some falling out on Facebook. I can't even remember what for, but he really turned me on to a lot. He was the first member of the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church. I remember I ran into and turned me on to my good friend Jeff Brown, and I've got a lot of respect for Carl. So hey, Carl, glad to see you on here. I think that Ganja came into the Rastafari language through Indian migrant workers. And they came into contact with slaves that had been fed the Bible and came into contact with them. And that term, the chalice, the chillum, all that type of stuff was adopted from that, possibly even dreadlocks. So there's lots of African evidence of dreadlocks. Carl's a member of the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church, and I did try to, see if there was any sort of long-standing historical tradition that could be traced back to Ethiopia. They did find, like in the 14th century, pipes that contained residues of cannabis in Ethiopia, and this predates the introduction of New World pipes. And the African term, Carl, I see they mentioned something about daga. That's the African term. But ganja, yeah, it's an Indian term. It goes way back. It can be identified in the Indian language, going at least 1,000 years. They've been using that term as well as earlier terms for cannabis. So it's definitely an Indian term and would have been adopted and likely by the influence of Indian migrant workers.
Well, that was very succinct, and I appreciate that greatly. And thank you for that question, Carl. We'll go to Michael Crowitz for our next question.
Great, man. So before I ask the question, just to kind of set it up, as I said before, the artifacts tell me what I know. So, that's my factual base, my evidence base. And then we sort of, I guess, I never really thought about it that hard, but we sort of come up with a sketch for what we, are guessing based on the history we do know. And I've always had this sketch in my head, I guess, for a long time, if not forever, as an activist, that it was probably the smell that probably got the first, humans interested in the plant, that got their attention. It was probably the stickiness of the plant that got them connected to the seeds, which then they, found probably to be the most useful thing, at least at first, a good food source. And looking at that sort of history and looking at that sort of context of humans, is there any hint in all the writings that you've looked at that somehow tribes and groups of humans that had discovered cannabis as a food source had a distinct advantage? Is there something that tells that story about tribes getting a better outcome from, health wise from cannabis?
Yeah, well, certainly, it's the most digestible form of a protein and one of the best single sources of balanced essential fatty acids. You know what I mean? So certainly nutritious. Dr. Jeffrey Guy and Dr. John McPartland, they have a great paper on a potential role of cannabis in what's referred to as the Great Leap Forward. And this is a time period of humanity where things like fire and the wheel and things like that are discovered, where all of a sudden we start making all those innovations. And they make a case for cannabis facilitating new ways of novel thinking and that sort of thing. You know what I mean? Sagan, Carl Sagan, he speculated that humanity first agricultural crop was cannabis. So that would be pretty big in that context, and culture grew out of agriculture. And he used the pygmies as examples. The pygmies were basically hunter-gatherers, but they began to grow cannabis when they started using it ritually and for hunting. And they couldn't count on finding it in the wild all the time, so they started planting it around their huts and stuff. And then from that, they started planting other plants. And according to the pygmies themselves, God gave them cannabis so they could be healthy and happy. You know what I mean? But archaeological evidence indicates that cannabis showed up in that region probably after the Muslim period. So I think there's something there to be said about time. You know what I mean? Agricultural time is a real facilitator in the keeping a record record of time. And, one of the first thing new users of cannabis notice is a difference in time experience, which could lead to the conception of the idea of time, you know what I mean? And the time carries a scythe. It seems like there's some sort of connection between time and cannabis. In regards to the end of the world stuff, it's comes from Zoroastrians, and the Zoroastrian guy that came up with that, King Vishtaspa, he drank cannabis infused wines. Even the end of the world, the end of time, is somehow sort of connected with this concept of cannabis in a way. I think we can place cannabis archaeologically back to, like, I think there's evidence of hemp rope that's been dated back as far as 24,000 years, which is getting close to the time of the Great Leap Forward. Elizabeth Wayland Barber, the foremost fiber specialist in the world, has dated tools used for making hemp cloth and stuff back to like 28,000 years ago. So we're getting really far back in time there. In regards to ritual use, the oldest archaeological evidence that we have comes from Ukraine and Romania, like from about 5,500 years ago. Also, Spain recently, they found a priestess or a queen or something that had been buried in a really nice tomb. And there they found a plate that had residues of cannabis and wine, indicating some sort of combined combination being used there. That's 5,000 years ago. So certainly older than any existing religion and influence and that sort of thing. It was in use, and I would say probably the oldest medicine as well,
I cannot tell you how absolutely thrilled we are to have you on here and have this discussion with you, because you're helping us process a great deal. And I know probably the people who are watching this, their ears are a little pinned back, but we encourage you to rewind and watch it and absorb it slowly, go minute by minute. But that's a lot for people who, if you're just new to cannabis and you're just new to cannabis and religion, you just kind of got a doctorate due to 30 plus years of hard work by this man. But we're not done yet.
I should also point out, this stuff might sound trite when you're talking about it, but this is one of my books here. It's like 777 pages, and it's got like a 40 or 50 page bibliography in it. And I'm very careful about referencing, and I'm also trying to be careful about distinguishing between hypothesis and theories and things like archaeological facts, like the Tellerrad is an archaeological fact, cannabosum is a linguistic theory. If it sounds fluffy, well, maybe take a look at what I've written about it and get a better idea, because probably the thing here I'm saying in a couple sentences, I've devoted a chapter to somewhere or something like that.
Exactly. So thanks again. Next up will be our friend Nate Landau, who it's a two-parter, and it's kind of a big one. So
yeah,
strap in for this one.
Thank you so much for joining us. Your every answer is just a gem, and I really appreciate it. You're really educating me on stuff. I grew up Jewish, and I learned so much about Judaism just from this thing. And so you partially answered the first part of my question, but I'll ask it anyways. As part of the Jewish faith, cannabis was used as part of the ceremonial incense. So I'm talking about in King Solomon's temple. I know you're talking about Tellerrad. If that was actually part of the agreement, because they say the incense smelled so good that you can smell it from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is like 40 kilometers away.
Yeah, it's all part of the same. That would have been all part of the same scene at that time, right? What would have been happening in Tellerrad would have been happening in the Temple of Solomon.
And then the second part of my question is the founder of Hasidic Judaism. He goes by the name of Baal Shem Tov. He, about 300 years ago, was said that not only did he use cannabis, but he also grew it and where he was in Eastern Europe. And it said it allowed him to start serving God out of love instead of fear. So until then and until today, I grew up ultra-Orthodox, and it was very, very important that we stick to the text very strictly, and it was all out of fear. And Hasidic Jews prayer, they're always singing and they're always happy. So do you know, from all your research, do you have, and this is only a rumor I've heard, Do you have any
Yeah,
facts about
it's like
this?
Israel Ben Eliezer, right? The same guy that you're talking about. I believe his full name was Israel Ben Eliezer, and the other name was given to him, that the one that you used. This goes back to pipes. Like he was describes smoking pipes, and they were putting prayers into the smoke. Probably influenced from the imagery of the pillar of smoke in Exodus. There's no that I'm aware. My friend Yosef Needham Ruiz has written a book, Cannabis Ducitus, and I think he went into this, and he said the first person, somebody in the 70s, first suggested that the pipe may have contained cannabis, and they are described as smoking Turkish tobacco. Turkish tobacco was often mixed with cannabis in those days. But there's no, that I know of, and I've looked into it, but maybe I missed something. There's no direct reference to it being cannabis or him growing cannabis that I'm aware of, or that Yosef Needham Ruiz is aware of either, because I discussed this with him. We do know that in the 19th century, that in Turkey, Jewish people were smoking cannabis and hashish and tobacco together in water pipes and stuff like that. So there is, a possibility of it. But I would have to say that until somebody comes up with something, maybe they get a hold of one of the pipes. It was supposed to have been, I don't know who's in possession of it now. It's supposed to be floating around somewhere. Maybe they could do residue analysis of it. But there's certainly other Hebrew references. Rabbi Eric Kaplan, who was a real authority on Jewish history and the Torah and whatnot, he suggested there was possible Kabbalistic use of psychedelic grasses being burnt. And in Jewish alchemy, going back to the 12th, 13th century, there's references to quintessences that prepared cannabis. And quintessences were basically tinctures. What they would do is they'd take wine, they'd bury it, let it separate it, keep the clearer stuff, get rid of the other stuff, and repeat this 7 times until they had a sort of a distilled alcoholic preparation, and then infuse it with plants. And we know that Jewish alchemists were using cannabis, and this influenced other alchemists like Raymond Lull, who some sources think may have been Jewish himself. And it appears in recipes for quintessences and arcanums with alchemists like Paracelsus and other alchemists as well. Infused wines as well. Rabbi, what's his name? I'm just trying to think of it. Rabbi Emanuel Low in Die Flower der Juden, he talks about a post-Talmudic, Talmudic period recipe in 6th century AD forward, where cannabis was infused with saffron into wine. And there's also 12th century references to wine, and also in the 19th century, there's references to Jewish people trading in cannabis-infused wine in the Middle East. And in regards to the Jewish people have always been tradespeople, great traders and stuff like that. And so in North Africa, Morocco, Middle East, they were often involved in hashish trade, and this is documented historically. So there's a lot to Jewish history and cannabis use, and I think even the modern cannabis movement, Allen Ginsberg really, I think, is, the father of the American cannabis movement, and figures like Jack Herer and Ed Rosenthal. I don't think we would be anywhere close to where we are without their foundational presence.
Thank you for that. Next up will be Councilmember Tony Landry. Tony.
I'm enjoying the conversation. There's a lot of Catholics here in Louisiana. We have like 4.5 million people and 31. And so my question is going to be informative for him. It says the Catholic Pope says if cannabis can help a person with a health issue, they should be allowed to have it.
Yeah, I think I kind of addressed that earlier. I talked about the 12th century Pope that had a recipe for cannabis infused wine for a number of medical ailments, and so different things happening at different times. But the Pope has also condemned recreational use, and I think it has been condemned in the past. So I believe that he's okay with medical use. I accept that. I think that there's been different stances with different popes through history.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate that.
Thank you for that, Tony. Next one is a small question with a very long answer. So for this one, we'll go to Council Member Wade Laughter. Wade.
Yeah, I'll start by thanking you, Chris, for joining us this evening. I'm stunned at the volume of information that you've given us a glimpse of. I'm just saying you're very good at describing your research and your what you've learned about this. My question is really, I think you might have already addressed it, but I came to our meeting a little bit late today due to my own dramas. But would you talk about how did we come to the word cannabis to describe this plant? I know there's a long history of use, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd really love to hear you summarize it, and also, yeah, what do you this isn't really part of the question that we've submitted to you, but I would love to hear your opinion on this. What do you think is what's the resistance to cannabis, particularly what you refer to as recreational use in organized religion, all about? Why so resistant to that
Maybe
idea?
ask me that after this other answer, because he'll probably take.
Yeah, they're two great questions, if you will,
yeah.
sir.
I'll probably forget the other question by the time I'm finished this one. So the term cannabis, the root word for it, either kana or kanap, is thought to be the oldest form of word stock. It's thought to be Proto-Indo-European. Indo-European languages groups includes French, German, English, Sanskrit, Avestan, all sorts of, it's just so widespread. And because of similarities in words, it can all be traced back that this all came from this Indo-European language. And cannabis is thought to be even older than that. It's thought to be Proto-Indo-European. And this goes back, thought to be the home of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, was in these regions where we found the ritual use of cannabis, Ukraine, Romania, places like that, Proto-Indo-Europeans. And the first Proto-Indo-Europeans were also, the people who domesticated the horse. And it's thought that the horse itself was only domesticated through the invention of hemp ropes and the ability to corral and control them through the invention of hemp ropes, right? And so through their later descendants, such as the Scythians, who were nomadic horse riders and used the plains as a highway through much of the ancient world, this spread the term and the use of cannabis, ritual use of cannabis likely traveled those routes, right? And so we see the original word is thought to be either kana or kana, somewhere along those type of lines. And the AN is specifically important. We see this in a lot of cannabis words in French, chamvra, in German Hanf, in the Hindu bang, Sanskrit sana, Vestan banha, on and on in our own cannabis. So there's that AN phrase that's thought to tie a lot of these words together and show their commonality. So it's early on, specifically widespread. It's funny because whenever there's an archaeological discovery, and I should probably mention some of these important, more recent archaeological discoveries besides Tellerrad, they're always saying, oh, this is the oldest evidence we've got, but also Tellerrad was 2800, but a few years before that, they discovered in China, first there was a discovery of a mummified man with a couple of big pouches of cannabis, and female cannabis at that had been specifically grown for use for ingestion. It was psychoactive cannabis, not like industrial hemp or something. And this is beginning of, cannabis cultivation in this region. And this was found with what's known as the Gushi culture. And they were in central China from 400 BC to about 2000 BC prior. And they were actually Indo-Europeans. So they spoke the same Indo-European language and are part of this wider group of Scythians and into the Zoroastrians and these other Indo-European groups, right? Besides these caches of female cannabis, there was a mummy with bouquets of female cannabis stripped on his body, and then also braziers where cannabis was burnt in the same manner as the Scythians, showing a continuity of use across Indo-European culture for its ritual use in funerary rites, right? So I think that's a pretty important one as well. And this is connected to another big archaeological site, the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which is in Afghan, but we know that they were in trade with these groups over in China because of artifacts from both places where, that came from both places and were found on both sites. And at this site, there was a large temple complex found, and the Russian archaeologist Victor Sarianati claimed he found the preparations for the Heoma Soma beverage. Heoma is the name of the beverage in the Vedic Zoroastrian religion, the Western Zoroastrian religion, and Soma is the name of it in the Hindu, the Indian Vedic religion. It predates Hinduism, the Rig Veda and stuff like that. And there they found, he believed he found evidence of cannabis in sediment in pots mixed with ephedra, as well as seed impressions of cannabis and cannabis growing at the site, and said that this was indicative of that it was the sacrament, Soma and Heoma, and I think when you take that into context with what we've discovered at Tel Arad, and it's textual evidence in Zoroastrianism, it's continued evidence in Hinduism, and it's evidence in Taoism, all these things. We're talking about a world sacrament, man, that does connect all these world religions, and it's based in history and historical facts, archaeology, textual evidence. It's not some sort of fantasy or belief, it's the Holy of Holies, man. I really think, it's the tree of life, man. It's here, man. It's like we're at this pivotal time in history, man. Everything's looking a little apocalyptic. Guy like Donald Trump's about to be reelected. Israel's looks like it could blossom into world war, man. And the planet's being killed by the petroleum industry, and climate change is happening. And here's this plant, that's like reaching out its green hand to us, saying there's another way, and we can save the old growth forest by growing hemp for paper and fiber and building products. We can move away from the oil industry and plastics with hemp plastics and fuels. We can move away from soil depleting cotton with cannabis cloth, and we can feed the world's hungry with a cannabis seed. There's just so much, that we can do with this plant, and this incredible medicine. We wouldn't even know about the endocannabinoid system revolutionizing medicine. Without this plant, the leaves are truly for the healing of the nations. And here it is, right here, right now. Well, we take it, well, we reach out and grab that. Well, be the plant of peace, I hope so.
So, Chris, my second question, what do you think's behind, or what's the reason so many organized religions have prohibitionist tendencies, if you will, around personal use for recreational, ceremonial, and to some extent they allow medical, at least the Catholics do. Yeah. But again, there seems to be a pretty universal hesitancy, or
I think it's fear, control, and ignorance, fear of the unknown. It's like shamanic plants, man. It's like that's a threat. It's not just cannabis, it's ayahuasca, it's psilocybin mushrooms. It's people having their own revelation. They're going, we have the answers right here in the book. And I've got the answers right here in this book. We have the answers in the book. I'm just using this book as a symbol. I'm not saying I have the answers. And that's what we do. It's all here, and it's all about us being the gateway to God. You're there, the book's here, and God's over there. We're in charge of the book, and that's a big part of it, is not people not having their own revelations, man. not having their own contact with the divine and coming up with their own spiritual ideals. You know what I mean? And that wasn't always the way with religion. You know what I mean? You look at Gnosticism. I think that was the big difference between what became Catholicism and in the early Christian church is Gnosticism was all about self-knowledge and having an experience. So I think there's that. I think there's fear. You know what I mean? These things have been demonized. A lot of these people, they're not coming at it from some traditionalist standpoint. They're just coming from the cultural milieu where these things have long been demonized, so fear and ignorance. They don't know of the history of it. You know what I mean? I should have mentioned the Sikh religion as well. There's branches of Sikhism where this plant as well. So there's another religion, but even Sikhism is a good example because the Nihang Sikhs, who were the guardians of the temple, they've been ostracized by the rest of Sikhism since, say, the 19th century as cannabis was rejected culturally. When the British Raj went into India and the Middle East, they were often dealing, there's books written about this, cannabis colonialism and madness, for instance. And it's about how the British Raj went into India. They're dealing with all these sadhus, they're stoned all the time, not respecting their authority, And so they came up with this. It was hard for them to deal with it because religion's such a breaking point when you're oppressing a culture. You start attacking that. That's kind of one of those things where they're going to really push back. And so they had to come up with a way of dealing with these guys who couldn't be swayed with wealth and whatnot, but were very influential over their communities. They're the ones that smoked the pot and answered the questions. You know what I mean? And so they were very influential individuals. And so they came up with the idea that the cannabis was driving them mad and started rounding them all up and throwing them in asylums they were building. And it changed the culture. It changed the culture. And it is a threat. It is a threat to them. I would say that the plant-based shamanic origins of religion is as much a threat to fundamental religion as Darwin's theory of evolution was to the myths of Adam and Eve in Genesis, because what it shows is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion itself, man. You put cannabis smoke into the tent of the meeting with Moses, and he's speaking to that pillar of smoke, man. That's a challenge, That's a challenge. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to put away some of these books, started thinking for ourselves a little more,
Thank
Yeah.
you, Carl. Thank you. Sorry, Chris. I'm stoned.
Well, wow, that's a lot to soak in. That's a lot you threw in an hour. We were joking behind the scenes there that you were basically throwing out the cliff notes here. But we're done with our questions. But do you have anything that you're promoting or any books or any writings? I saw
this is the latest book. I talked a lot about the Telerad stuff. That's actually one of the altars at Telerad, Jerusalem, and it's called Cannabis Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World. You can find all my books on Amazon or other major booksellers. You can follow me on Facebook. I'm always posting cannabis history stuff and whatnot. You Google search me, my name in cannabis, or YouTube search me. You'll find lots of articles and lectures and that type of stuff. I'm mostly just kind of hanging out here in Nova Scotia and surfing. I kind of just felt so hopeless out there with everything going on in the world. I just feel like continue on doing a lot of stuff's banging my head, and I needed a break. So I decided to get back into surfing and retire. And I'm out here in Nova Scotia surfing Atlantic waves and still doing a bit of writing and talking and stuff like that, but not really a whole lot else.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure. Does anybody have any last questions for Chris before we let him go? All right. Well, with that in mind, let me bring it back to us. I would like to thank our members, Peggy Jones, Al Byrne, Michael Krawitz, Nate Landau, Tony Landry, and Wade Laughter, and we were joined by the venerable Carl Olson. And I am Etienne Fontaine. Thank you very much for our V.A.C. Roundtable number 65, Chris Bennett.
Thank you so much.
Been an honor.
Take care, guys.